The night Dean Martin finally disappeared did not arrive with flashing cameras or a crowded hospital room. It came quietly, the way so much of his pain had always come, wrapped in silence and routine. In Beverly Hills, long after the applause had faded and the laughter no longer followed him home, he sat alone at familiar tables, ordering the same meals, staring into space while the world still believed he was untouchable. To millions, Dean Martin remained the eternal symbol of ease and charm, the man who never seemed rattled by anything life threw at him. But behind that image, something irreversible had already broken, and it was breaking slowly enough that almost no one noticed. There is something uniquely cruel about watching a legend fade while the myth stays intact. Dean Martin was admired precisely because he appeared immune to sadness. His voice floated effortlessly, his smile suggested nothing could ever weigh him down, and his presence carried a promise that life could be lived lightly, without consequence. Yet the final chapter of his life would reveal the opposite truth. The man who made loneliness look elegant was, in reality, being consumed by it. Fame had not protected him from loss. It had only ensured that his suffering would unfold out of sight. The tragedy did not announce itself all at once. It crept in through absence. Fewer public appearances, shorter performances, long stretches where Dean simply did not answer the phone. Friends sensed a change, but struggled to describe it. He was still polite, still gentle, still capable of humor, but something essential was missing. The spark behind the eyes that once lit up rooms had dimmed. Those closest to him would later say that it felt as though he had already begun saying goodbye long before death arrived. What made this decline especially haunting was that Dean was not alone. Nearby, always just out of frame, was a woman who had once shared his life in full view of the spotlight. Jean, his former wife, no longer held his name, but she still carried his pain. While the world assumed she had moved on, she remained quietly present, watching a man she loved unravel in slow motion. She did not intervene. She did not demand explanations. She simply stayed close enough to make sure he was not completely abandoned to his grief. It was a kind of devotion Hollywood rarely tells stories about, because it lacks glamour and refuses to resolve neatly. To understand how devastating this ending truly was, it is important to grasp how far Dean Martin had once traveled to escape hardship. His life had begun nowhere near luxury. He had clawed his way out of obscurity, endured humiliation, physical punishment, and relentless uncertainty, all in pursuit of a future that promised freedom. That journey made his later success feel like a triumph over suffering itself. But the illusion of victory masked a deeper vulnerability. Dean had learned how to perform strength long before he learned how to process loss. The man the audience saw on stage was a construction, carefully assembled and flawlessly maintained. The slurred jokes, the glass in his hand, the relaxed posture were all part of a persona that gave people permission to laugh without worry. What they did not see was the discipline behind it, or the emotional distance it created. The longer he played the role, the harder it became to step outside it. Eventually, even those who loved him struggled to reach the man beneath the image. The turning point that sealed his fate would not come from scandal or failure. It came from a loss so profound that no performance could disguise it. When that moment arrived, Dean Martin did not collapse publicly. He withdrew. He stopped fighting. The man who had spent decades mastering the art of making pain invisible no longer had the strength to hide it. Silence replaced humor. Routine replaced ambition. Waiting replaced hope. What makes this story so unsettling is not simply that a star died, but that he did so while the world still believed he was smiling. The tragedy lies in the contrast between what people thought they knew and what was actually happening behind closed doors. Dean Martin did not fall dramatically. He faded, and in that fading, he revealed a truth that cuts through the glamour of Hollywood's golden age. Some losses do not destroy you loudly. They dismantle you quietly, one day at a time, until there is nothing left to hold onto except memory and habit. This is where his story truly begins, not in applause or success, but in the slow, painful unraveling of a man who had spent his life convincing others that nothing could ever hurt him. Long before the world learned to associate Dean Martin with effortless charm and late-night laughter, his life was shaped by a very different kind of silence. He was born Dino Paul Crocetti in a small, working-class corner of Steubenville, Ohio, a town defined by steel mills, smoke-filled skies, and the constant pressure to survive rather than dream. His parents were Italian immigrants who carried with them not only accents and traditions, but also the weight of displacement. At home, Italian was spoken freely, food was shared generously, and music flowed naturally. Yet beyond the front door, Dino was reminded every day that he did not quite belong. School was not a refuge. It was a battlefield. Dino entered classrooms unable to understand the language spoken around him, mocked for his accent, and isolated by his difference. Teachers mistook confusion for disinterest, and classmates saw vulnerability as weakness. Years later, he would laugh it off with jokes about being too smart for school, but those who knew him well understood the truth. Leaving school was not an act of rebellion. It was an escape from humiliation. By his mid-teens, he had walked away entirely, trading textbooks for labor and uncertainty. The jobs came fast and disappeared just as quickly. He worked in steel mills where the heat burned and the noise never stopped, pumped gas at stations where customers barely looked him in the eye, delivered milk in the early hours of the morning, and even ran bootleg liquor during Prohibition. Each job hardened him in a different way. Survival demanded adaptability, and Dino learned early how to read people, how to disarm tension with a smile, and how to hide fear behind confidence. These were not skills taught in classrooms. They were learned through necessity. At night, another version of Dino began to surface. He boxed under the name Kid Crochet, stepping into small rings where the crowd was close enough to smell sweat and blood. He was not a great fighter. In fact, he lost most of his matches. But boxing gave him something invaluable. It taught him how to absorb pain without flinching. Broken noses, split lips, and bruised knuckles became part of his identity. Years later, when his nose was surgically fixed with the help of a friend in comedy, the scars remained beneath the surface, both physical and emotional. During these years of instability, Dino lived with almost nothing. He shared cramped apartments, sometimes unable to afford food. With fellow performers, he staged bare knuckle fights in living rooms, charging small crowds a few dollars just to make rent. On worse nights, hunger pushed him into quiet acts of desperation, pretending to receive phone calls in diners so he could steal bites from abandoned plates. These moments etched a lasting impression on him. Poverty did not simply scare him. It taught him that security was fragile and could vanish at any moment. Music, however, offered something different. It was the one place where Dino felt naturally whole. His mother's love of singing had planted a seed early on, and as a young man, he began to sing wherever someone would listen. In an illegal casino hidden behind a tobacco shop, he sang softly between card games, more to soothe himself than to impress anyone else. One night, a bandleader overheard him and recognized something rare. That chance encounter changed the trajectory of his life. He adopted the stage name Dino Martini, inspired by Italian tenors, and began touring small venues across Ohio and Pennsylvania. The performances were modest, but they offered consistency. For the first time, his voice earned him respect rather than ridicule. Eventually, a mentor suggested a subtle but critical change. Drop the Italian-sounding name. Make it simpler. Make it American. Dino Martini became Dean Martin, and with that transformation came opportunity, but also distance from the boy he once was. As his career slowly stabilized, Dean searched for emotional grounding. He found it in Elizabeth and Betty McDonald, a young woman who loved him before fame complicated everything. They married early, sharing cramped apartments, financial stress, and uncertainty. Betty became his anchor during years when success was far from guaranteed. While Dean performed in smoky clubs for modest pay, she built a home around patience and sacrifice. Together, they raised children, balancing hope with exhaustion. Yet even in these early years, the tension between ambition and stability was present. Dean craved success not only for comfort, but for validation. He wanted to prove that the boy who could not speak English in school deserved to be heard. As his recognition grew, so did the temptations that came with it. Fame introduced him to a world that rewarded charm and forgave absence. The more his career demanded him, the more his personal life began to fracture. Betty struggled deeply, particularly with alcoholism, a battle that eroded the foundation of their marriage. Dean, surrounded by attention and opportunity, did not resist distraction. Infidelity, though rarely discussed publicly at the time, became part of the quiet unraveling of their family. By the late 1940s, the marriage collapsed under pressures neither of them were prepared to withstand. Dean was awarded custody of their children, an unusual outcome that reflected both Betty's struggles and the rigid expectations of the era. This period marked a critical emotional shift. Dean Martin achieved professional momentum while losing domestic stability. He learned to compartmentalize pain, to move forward without resolving what was left behind. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Loss was never confronted directly. It was absorbed, buried, and masked with humor or work. The foundation of Dean Martin's later tragedy was not built in fame. It was laid in these early years, shaped by displacement, insecurity, and a lifelong habit of enduring rather than healing. The man who would one day define cool had learned, long before the spotlight found him, how to survive quietly, even when it meant carrying unresolved grief forward into every chapter that followed. By the mid-1980s, the life of Dean Martin appeared from the outside to have settled into a comfortable twilight. The frantic pace of earlier decades had slowed. The demands of constant filming and touring had eased. To the public, this looked like a well-earned rest, the quiet reward for a man who had already given the world more than enough. But beneath that surface calm, Dean was already carrying a growing sense of emptiness. His children were adults, his marriages were behind him, and the friendships that once filled his nights now existed mostly as memories. What remained was routine and an unspoken dependence on the one presence that still anchored him emotionally, his son Dean Paul. Dean Paul Martin was not just another child in a famous family. He was the embodiment of everything Dean Martin admired and quietly wished he had been able to protect. Handsome, disciplined, and driven, Dean Paul forged his own identity as an actor, a musician, and later as a pilot in the Air National Guard. He was not living in his father's shadow. He was building something distinctly his own. For Dean, watching his son succeed without bitterness felt like redemption. It was proof that the chaos of his own life had not damaged everything it touched. Their bond was not loud or demonstrative. They were alike in that way. Conversations were brief, affectionate without sentimentality, heavy with understanding rather than explanation. Friends noticed that when Dean Paul entered a room, Dean Martin straightened slightly, smiled more easily, and seemed grounded in a way that nothing else quite achieved. In a life marked by emotional compartmentalization, his son was the one connection that did not require performance. Then, on a cold March day in 1987, that connection was severed without warning. Dean Paul Martin's fighter jet disappeared during a routine training mission over the mountains of California, swallowed by a snowstorm. The news arrived with brutal efficiency. No build-up, no preparation, just the knowledge that his son was missing, followed by days of searching that stretched hope thin before finally extinguishing it. When the wreckage was found 6 days later, the reality settled in with a weight that could not be deflected by humor or denial. For Dean Martin, this was not simply grief. It was annihilation. Those close to him would later say that everything stopped at that moment. He did not cry publicly. He did not lash out. He withdrew into a silence so complete it frightened the people around him. The man who had once navigated life through charm and controlled detachment no longer attempted either. He did not want distraction. He did not want consolation. He wanted nothing. At the time of the crash, Dean had been preparing for what was meant to be a triumphant return. Alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., He was scheduled to embark on a high-profile tour, a reunion designed to celebrate legacy, brotherhood, and endurance. The ultimate event was marketed as nostalgia and joy. Instead, it became a painful reminder of everything Dean had lost. He attempted to go on stage out of loyalty and habit, but it was immediately clear he was no longer present. He stood where he had always stood, delivered lines he had spoken 1,000 times, yet his voice lacked its former warmth. The performance was hollow. After only a handful of shows, Dean walked away from the tour entirely. No dramatic announcement, no explanation. He simply stopped. Sinatra, who had known him for decades, tried to push him back toward the stage, believing routine might help him survive the pain. But Dean refused. This time, there was no role he was willing to play. The act that had sustained him for a lifetime had finally failed. From that point forward, Dean Martin's decline accelerated, not because of illness, but because of resignation. He was not angry at the world. He was finished with it. Friends described him as distant but gentle, exhausted rather than broken. He spent his days moving through familiar spaces without engagement, returning to the same restaurants, ordering the same meals, sitting alone even when surrounded by people. The silence that followed him was no longer a byproduct of fame. It was a choice. During this period, Jean re-entered his life in the only way she knew how, quietly. Though they had been divorced for years, she recognized the severity of his withdrawal immediately. She did not attempt to reclaim her place. She did not force conversation. She simply stayed near, checking on him discreetly, sharing the same spaces without intrusion. Where others felt helpless in the face of his grief, Jean understood that presence was enough. Dean did not ask for help, but he accepted her nearness without resistance. Those who observed this dynamic were struck by its simplicity. There were no scenes, no declarations of love, no reconciliation narratives fit for tabloids. It was two people bound by history and loss, navigating the aftermath of a tragedy that words could not touch. Jean became a silent witness to Dean's fading spirit, aware that nothing could be done to reverse what had been set in motion. Dean himself made no effort to hide his resignation. When he spoke at all, his words were stripped of irony. He told friends he was waiting to die, not as a joke, but as a statement of fact. He declined medical advice, dismissed encouragement, and expressed no interest in recovery, emotional or otherwise. His grief was not explosive. It was consuming, a slow erosion of purpose that left behind only habit and memory. This was the true turning point of Dean Martin's life, not the end, but the irreversible moment when survival gave way to surrender. The tragedy did not destroy his career in a dramatic sense. It rendered it meaningless. The laughter, the applause, the decades of admiration no longer reached him. The one thing he could not perform his way through was the loss of his son. From this point on, Dean Martin existed rather than lived, moving through the final years of his life as a man who had already said goodbye internally. Everything that followed was not a struggle to recover, but a quiet acceptance of an ending he no longer wished to postpone. The aftermath of Dean Martin's withdrawal was not marked by chaos or public concern. It was marked by absence. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. The entertainment industry, which had once depended on his presence, quietly adjusted to life without him. There was no scandal to explain his disappearance, no dramatic illness to justify concern. He simply faded, and in Hollywood, fading often attracts less attention than falling. For a man whose entire career had been built on being effortlessly visible, this invisibility was its own kind of punishment. Those closest to Dean Martin noticed the change immediately, not because he became difficult, but because he became unreachable. He did not lash out. He did not complain. He moved through his days with a subdued politeness that made it hard to intervene. Friends who tried to engage him found themselves speaking into silence. He listened, nodded, sometimes smiled faintly, but his responses were hollow, detached from any sense of future. It was as if his emotional life had been sealed off the day his son died. The practical consequences of this withdrawal were significant. Dean stopped performing almost entirely. Projects that had once excited him were abandoned without negotiation. Producers who had waited years for his availability were left without explanation. Financially, he was secure, but professionally, he had chosen disappearance over legacy management. Unlike many stars who spend their later years carefully shaping how they will be remembered, Dean showed no interest in preservation. Awards, tributes, and retrospectives meant nothing to him. They belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. Psychologically, the cost was even greater. Grief reshaped his daily habits. He began frequenting the same restaurants night after night, sitting alone at familiar tables, ordering the same meals, engaging in brief, polite exchanges with staff who knew him by routine rather than intimacy. These outings were not social. They were rituals, anchors to a world that no longer felt real. Returning home afterward, he surrounded himself with television reruns and old photographs, fragments of a past that felt safer than the present. Physically, his health began to reflect his emotional exhaustion. Decades of smoking caught up with him, and his body showed signs of long-term strain. Doctors urged him to consider treatment, to take proactive steps while there was still time. Dean refused. His refusal was not rooted in fear or denial. It was rooted in indifference. He had lost the one person who made endurance meaningful. Survival, without purpose, held no appeal. Jean remained close throughout this period, though always at a distance that respected his withdrawal. She did not move back into his life in any formal sense. Yet she positioned herself nearby, sharing spaces without imposing conversation. Friends noticed that she often dined in the same restaurants, arriving separately, sitting apart, leaving without acknowledgement. It was not secrecy, it was consideration. She understood that Dean did not want to be reminded of what he had lost, but he also could not bear to be completely alone. The broader social impact of Dean's decline was subtle but profound. Younger entertainers who had grown up idolizing him struggled to reconcile the myth with the reality unfolding quietly behind closed doors. Industry peers spoke in hushed tones about how grief could dismantle even the most resilient personas. Dean became an unspoken cautionary tale, not about excess or scandal, but about emotional isolation. His story challenged the comforting belief that success and admiration could insulate a person from devastating loss. Publicly, there were occasional sightings that sparked brief media curiosity. Photos of Dean sitting alone, looking thinner, older, more withdrawn, circulated without context. Speculation followed, but it lacked urgency. The absence of drama made it easy to dismiss his condition as natural aging. Few understood that what they were witnessing was not decline through time, but retreat through grief. As the years passed, Dean's world narrowed further. Relationships that required emotional investment fell away. Conversations became shorter. Plans were avoided entirely. He lived within a shrinking circle of familiarity, unwilling to introduce new variables into a life already fractured beyond repair. Those who loved him learned to accept this version of Dean, even as they mourned the man he had once been. The consequences of his tragedy were not confined to him alone. Jean carried the burden of witnessing his slow disappearance, aware that love could not cure resignation. Friends grappled with helplessness, forced to confront the limits of loyalty when faced with grief that refuses intervention. Even fans, though largely unaware of the details, sensed an absence that could not be explained by retirement alone. Dean Martin's story at this stage was no longer about fame or talent. It was about the cost of unresolved loss and the quiet devastation that follows when a person decides, consciously or not, that continuing no longer serves a purpose. The applause had ended long before his heart did. What remained was a man living in the shadow of a single moment that had erased everything else. There were stories that never reached newspapers, moments that unfolded far from cameras and contracts, known only to a small circle who understood how fragile Dean Martin had become after everything fell apart. These were not dramatic scenes. They were quiet fragments of daily life that revealed more about his inner world than any public appearance ever could. In these moments, the legend dissolved, leaving behind a man navigating grief with no language for it. One friend recalled visiting Dean at home late one evening, expecting conversation, perhaps even laughter, only to find him sitting in near darkness, television flickering silently in the background. He did not acknowledge the screen. He did not seem aware of time passing. When asked if everything was all right, Dean answered gently that nothing was wrong and nothing was right either. It was not despair in his voice. It was neutrality, as though emotional extremes no longer applied to him. That neutrality was what frightened those who loved him most. Another longtime associate described how Dean stopped listening to music altogether. For a man whose life had been shaped by melody and rhythm, the absence of music was striking. Records gathered dust. Radios remained off. When asked why, Dean reportedly said that music reminded him too much of who he used to be. Sound carried memory, and memory carried pain. Silence, by contrast, asked nothing of him. It allowed him to exist without confronting the distance between past and present. Jean remained a constant presence in these years, though always in the background. She did not announce herself, did not demand acknowledgement. Sometimes she would leave small notes through intermediaries, messages that required no response. Other times, she would simply ensure he was not entirely alone, coordinating quietly with staff or friends without ever intruding. Those who witnessed this loyalty understood that it was not about reconciliation. It was about responsibility to shared history, and perhaps an unspoken promise made long before their marriage ended. There were also moments when Dean's grief surfaced unexpectedly, not through tears, but through small behavioral shifts. He would pause mid-sentence, as if searching for a word he could not find, then abandon the thought entirely. He would ask about his son in the present tense, then quickly correct himself, as though startled by his own memory. These slips were brief, but they revealed how deeply loss had altered his sense of reality. Time no longer flowed cleanly forward. It folded back on itself. Friends noticed that Dean avoided places associated with celebration. He declined invitations to birthdays, anniversaries, and gatherings that required joy. Yet he did not avoid people altogether. Instead, he gravitated toward neutral spaces, settings that demanded nothing emotionally. Restaurants, quiet lounges, short car rides. These environments allowed him to remain connected without vulnerability. He could be present without being exposed. One particularly telling habit emerged during this period. Dean began revisiting old photographs late at night. Not albums curated for nostalgia, but loose images tucked away in drawers. Photos from before fame, before polish, before loss. He did not display them. He did not share them. He simply looked at them alone. Those who learned of this habit believed it was his way of grounding himself, reminding himself that his identity existed long before the spotlight, and perhaps might survive beyond it, even if only internally. Despite his withdrawal, Dean was not unkind. Staff members spoke of his politeness, his habit of thanking people quietly, sometimes with handwritten notes. These gestures were subtle, almost reflexive, remnants of the man who had learned early in life that dignity mattered. Even in resignation, he maintained courtesy. It was one of the few aspects of himself he did not relinquish. There were attempts, gentle ones, to re-engage him creatively. Musicians suggested informal sessions. Producers floated low-pressure appearances. Dean listened patiently and declined every time, not out of fear, but because he no longer believed performance had meaning without connection. Applause felt hollow. Recognition felt misplaced. The world still wanted the image of Dean Martin, but he no longer felt capable of inhabiting it. Jean's role during this time was perhaps the most quietly heroic. She carried the knowledge that nothing she did could restore him, yet she remained present anyway. When others spoke of moving on, she spoke of staying near. When others framed grief as something to be overcome, she treated it as something to be lived with. In doing so, She offered Dean the only form of comfort he could accept, companionship without expectation. These unspoken moments, these private rituals and silences, formed the true emotional core of Dean Martin's final years. They were not dramatic enough for headlines, but they revealed a truth far more enduring. Grief does not always scream. Sometimes it settles in, reshaping life so subtly that the world barely notices, even as everything changes. In these quiet spaces, Dean Martin was no longer a star, no longer a symbol. He was simply a man carrying love and loss in equal measure, navigating days that asked him to keep breathing even when meaning had faded. It was here, in the unseen corners of his life, that the cost of fame, of survival, and of love fully revealed itself. As the years drew closer to their end, the meaning of Dean Martin's life began to shift, not in public memory, but in the quiet space where reflection replaces ambition. The world continued to celebrate the image he left behind, the smooth voice, the relaxed grin, the illusion of ease that defined an era. Yet the man himself no longer measured his life by applause or recognition. For Dean Martin, legacy was no longer something to be managed. It was something to be endured. What remained undeniable was the scale of what he had given. His career had spanned generations, shaping American entertainment in ways that outlived trends and rivalries. His music became a language of intimacy, played at weddings, late-night gatherings, and quiet moments when people searched for warmth. His films revealed a depth that critics initially underestimated, proving that charm and vulnerability could coexist. His television presence redefined what authenticity looked like on screen long before that word became fashionable. These accomplishments were real, substantial, and lasting. Yet for Dean, they had lost their power to console. In private, his understanding of success had narrowed dramatically. Achievements meant little when separated from the people who had given them meaning. The death of his son reframed every triumph as incomplete. No record sales or standing ovations could compensate for the absence that now defined his days. In this sense, Dean's later years offered a sobering lesson about the limits of external validation. Fame can amplify joy, but it cannot replace connection. It can preserve an image, but it cannot protect the heart. Those who reflected on his life after his withdrawal often spoke about contradiction. Dean Martin was celebrated as the embodiment of confidence, yet he spent his final years confronting helplessness. He was admired for making life appear effortless, yet survival had never come easily to him. From childhood struggles with language and identity to the pressures of maintaining a public persona, his strength had always been functional rather than emotional. He learned how to persist, not how to heal. That distinction would define his final chapter. There is a temptation, when examining figures like Dean Martin, to search for lessons neatly packaged as inspiration or warning. His story resists that simplicity. It does not suggest that fame is inherently destructive, nor does it argue that success guarantees emptiness. Instead, it reveals something more uncomfortable. Pain accumulates when it is deferred. Loss compounds when it is never confronted. Dean Martin mastered the art of endurance, but endurance alone could not save him from grief that demanded acknowledgement. Jean's role in this legacy cannot be separated from his own. Her quiet loyalty reframed what partnership can mean beyond romance or obligation. She did not attempt to rewrite their past or redefine their relationship for public consumption. She accepted the limits of her influence and chose presence over resolution. In doing so, she modeled a form of love rarely celebrated, one that exists without expectation of reward or recognition. Her place in Dean's final years underscores a truth often overlooked. Sometimes legacy is not built through action, but through steadfastness. As Dean's health declined and his physical world grew smaller, his story took on a different weight for those who observed it closely. Younger performers, many of whom had entered the industry chasing the same ease he seemed to embody, began to understand the cost of living behind a persona. His life became a quiet reference point, a reminder that emotional survival requires more than charm and discipline. It requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one role Dean Martin never learned to play. In the end, his legacy exists on two parallel levels. One is public and enduring, preserved through recordings, films, and the collective memory of an audience that continues to find comfort in his work. The other is private and unresolved, a story of resilience that reached its limit, of love that endured without repair, and of grief that reshaped everything it touched. Neither version invalidates the other. Together, they form a complete portrait. Dean Martin's life asks difficult questions rather than offering clear conclusions. What does it mean to succeed if the cost is silence? How much of ourselves do we sacrifice to meet expectations, and what happens when we can no longer maintain the performance? Is peace something that arrives through achievement, or something that must be cultivated long before loss arrives? These questions linger because they have no easy answers. Dean Martin left behind laughter, music, and a vision of elegance that continues to captivate. He also left behind a cautionary truth, one that speaks softly but insistently. A life can be extraordinary and still be unbearably heavy. Legacy can be luminous and still incomplete. And sometimes, the most honest measure of a life is not how brightly it shined, but how quietly it endured when the light was gone. The story of Dean Martin does not end with applause, nor does it conclude with the certainty that so many biographies try to offer. It ends in a quieter place, where meaning is felt rather than explained. By the time his body began to fail, the man who wants to find ease had already accepted an ending long before death arrived. His days were no longer shaped by anticipation, but by familiarity. The same streets, the same restaurants, the same silences. He did not seek distraction. He did not seek understanding. He simply remained. When doctors diagnosed his illness and urged intervention, Dean declined without drama. There was no bitterness in his refusal, no anger at fate, only fatigue. He told those around him that he had lived a good life, a sentence that carried more exhaustion than pride. It was not a declaration of satisfaction. It was an admission that he no longer had the strength to begin again. For a man who had survived poverty, ridicule, professional doubt, and emotional upheaval, this final decision was not surrender in the traditional sense. It was closure on his own terms. His death came on Christmas Day, a date heavy with symbolism and contradiction. While families gathered in celebration, Dean Martin passed quietly, his body finally matching the stillness his spirit had carried for years. News of his passing spread quickly, and the response was immediate. Tributes poured in from across the entertainment world. Friends remembered his generosity. Colleagues recalled his professionalism. Audiences mourned the loss of a voice that had accompanied so many of their lives. For a brief moment, the world paused to acknowledge what he had given. Las Vegas, the city that had helped shape his legend, dimmed its lights in his honor. It was a rare gesture, reserved for those whose presence had left a permanent mark. The image was powerful, an entire strip of brightness falling into darkness, not in spectacle, but in respect. Yet even in that moment, there was an irony impossible to ignore. The man being honored had spent his final years seeking the very quiet that now surrounded his memory. He was laid to rest beneath a simple inscription, a line from the song that defined him for millions. Everybody loves somebody sometime. The words were familiar, comforting, and incomplete. They captured the warmth he offered the world, but not the loneliness he carried alone. That tension is what makes his story endure. Dean Martin was loved widely, yet deeply isolated, celebrated constantly, yet internally withdrawn. His life resists simplification because it contains both truths fully. Jean followed him years later, her life unfolding without spectacle, just as it had during his final years. She never sought recognition for her devotion. She never attempted to reshape the narrative around their relationship. Her presence in his story remains understated but essential. She represents the part of love that does not demand resolution, the kind that exists even when nothing can be fixed. In many ways, her quiet loyalty completes the story that fame could not. The Martin family continued to carry the weight of loss long after Dean's passing. Their contributions to music and culture remained, but so did the imprint of grief that had reshaped everything. The brilliance the world remembers was real. So is the heartbreak that lived alongside it. Neither cancels the other. Together, they form the full measure of a life lived under extraordinary pressure. What lingers most after examining Dean Martin's final chapter is not sadness alone, but recognition. His story speaks to anyone who has ever hidden pain behind competence, who has relied on routine instead of healing, who has mistaken endurance for resolution. It challenges the comforting idea that time alone repairs loss. It suggests instead that unspoken grief changes us quietly, permanently, whether we acknowledge it or not. Dean Martin gave the world a vision of grace under pressure, of laughter that softened hard edges, of music that made loneliness feel shared. In return, the world gave him admiration, opportunity, and applause. What it could not give him was immunity from loss or a map for surviving it. That truth does not diminish his legacy. It deepens it. In the end, his story remains unfinished in the way all honest stories do. There is no definitive answer to whether he found peace. Perhaps peace, for him, was not happiness or recovery, but release. Perhaps it was the quiet certainty that he no longer had to perform, no longer had to endure. What is certain is that his life leaves behind a question worth sitting with. How many people around us are admired, celebrated, even loved, yet quietly unraveling in silence? Dean Martin's voice still plays in rooms filled with warmth and memory. His image still smiles from screens and photographs. But behind that smile lies a reminder that even the most effortless grace can conceal a lifetime of struggle. Remembering him fully means holding both truths at once, the light he offered so freely and the shadow he carried alone.